All of your work had great nuance. I mean, The Orchid Thief, I remember when the movie rights were sold.
When they first gave me the script and said, just read it with an open mind, and I thought, wait, I didn't expect to be in this movie. There's a scene of Charlie Kaufman watching a porn channel, and there I am. And I said, okay, all right, hold on a minute.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Karp. I'm the CEO of Simon Schuster, but more importantly, I am a former editor of Susan Orlean, who is with us here today. Susan is the best-selling author of the library book, The Orchid Thief, and RIN TIN TIN, and her new book is called Joyride. Susan, welcome to The Right Reasons.
I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I am very happy to see you again. So I know that I shouldn't have favorites, but but you are one of my favorite writers. You always have been from the time I was a much younger editor at Random House. And
Thank you.
And I guess I want to start, the book is called Joyride. So let's start with a very simple question. Why did you come up with that title?
We were struggling a little with the title, and it's a memoir, so it was a very different kind of title for me to write. This is my first memoir. I didn't like any of the titles that essentially were billboards saying, this is a memoir. And one day, I, honest to God, just had the vision of a joyride. And, you know, it has a bit of a subversive kind of meaning, which is when I was a kid, a joyride meant you hot-wired a car and drove it around for a little bit and then left it. You weren't stealing the car, but you were just borrowing it. And that image was so immediately appropriate because this book is so much about my career as a writer, and a lot of what I do is take a ride in someone else's life for a little while, seeing what it's like inside. It's as if the word just kind of came to mind and the image stuck instantly. And I knew that I had this photograph that a friend took of me. I think it was maybe my freshman or sophomore year in college, where I was riding in a little bumper car at Disney World, looking very joyful. So it all came together very naturally.
Now, the origin story for this book, my recollection when Avid Reader Press acquired it, was that it started out as a book about writing, and it evolved. So can you talk a little bit about the evolution of it?
Absolutely. I had talked to Jofi about doing a book about writing, and I love teaching. I love talking about writing, so that was very natural to me. Then I thought, well, I don't want to write a textbook. I think I'll take one of my pieces and break it down in real detail, how I wrote it, circumstances around writing it. Nothing exists in a vacuum. I began thinking, if I take this particular story, The American Man, age 10, which I wrote for Esquire, how can I explain what and why it occurred without giving you context of where I was in my life and why it mattered to me? So in order to give that context, I had to pull the camera back a little. And then I thought, well, does it make sense to say where I was at that moment without saying how I came to be a writer at all? So the camera in my mind kept being pulled back a little further and a little further until it felt much more natural to tell the story of my writing as part of the story of my life, because they really are one and the same. I don't feel they can be separated.
They can't be. And it was fascinating, as somebody who has watched your whole writing career, to see the backstory to it. You came into my life pretty much with The American Man at age 10. It was on the cover of Esquire.
Right.
I read it. It knocked me out. I wrote you a fan letter. We had lunch. And I'd been following your byline, and I guess you'd been in Rolling Stone, you'd been in other magazines, and there was just something special about you. There's something special about the way you wrote. And after I read this book, I realized that there was just so much you were doing that made you the great literary journalist that you are. And I think you're one of the best. So what I'm wondering is how you started to think about developing that technique. I mean, was it how much of it was premeditated? How much of it was instinctive?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is a little bit of both. I do think that the best writing is the most authentic. The way you engage with the world authentically is reflected in your work. I don't think you can separate them. I think writing really is an attempt to tap into what's truly in your heart. So anything artificial reads on the page as being very artificial. So I think you're always working toward that impulse that's natural. And since I was a kid, I embraced the world in this particular way. I talk a lot in the book about how I really feel my parents had a lot to do with that. My dad in particular had this attitude of, well, it's always interesting to find out what's going on and to go down the path you didn't anticipate and to shake it up a little and talk to someone who isn't like you. It was in my DNA to approach thinking of the world that way. I rarely found it interesting to write about people like me. Not that there's something inherently wrong with people like me, but my impulse was, what are other people's lives like? And particularly, what are the lives like that aren't going to get in a headline, that aren't the big celebrity profiling? And that's why American Man was the touchstone for me for this book, because it had begun as a celebrity profile assignment, and for whatever reason, and I was young enough that this was a rather bold suggestion, but I said to Terry McDonald, the editor of Esquire, even though it was my first assignment with them, I said, well, he wanted me to profile Macaulay Culkin, who was 10 at the time, just to give you some context of how long ago this was. And I thought, I'm not really very interested in Macaulay Culkin. Celebrities are celebrities, and you're going to get a certain prepackaged story about a celebrity. And for whatever crazy reason, I said, how about if I just profile an ordinary 10-year-old boy instead? Because to be honest, 10-year-old boys were, to me, this unknown world. I didn't know a thing about them. I didn't have children at the time. I didn't know a lot of little kids. What's it like to be a 10-year-old boy? To my great delight, and I really have to give Terry McDonald a lot of credit for this, which was, he said, sure, go ahead. Rare to do such a thing, because it could be the most boring story in the world. Or it could be a very difficult story, which it certainly was. It's a lot harder to write about an ordinary life in an illuminated way than to write about a celebrities. I've done many celebrity profiles, and people are naturally interested in them. You don't have to work very hard to make them fun to read. My career is in many ways, a true reflection of how I am in the world.
And how you come at the world. Because I was talking to a New York Times reporter once, and I mentioned to her that I work with you. And she said, I read her stuff, and I honestly don't know how she does it. She comes at a story from an angle that would never occur to me. And I see that again and again. And it's certainly true of that piece about the American Man at age 10. There's another piece that I love that you write about in this book about Biff the show dog. There's a moment, first of all, if you could just sort of tell us about Biff and why you decided to write about Biff, and then also your decision to interview Biff, which I always...
It's one of either the high point or low point of my professional life. This was during the era of the supermodel. Supermodels dominated popular culture. This was the era of Karlie Kloss and, Kate Moss. And I mean, that was very much the fabric of the culture at the time, were these supermodels. So hold that thought and then add to that the fact that I just love animals, and I'm always happy when I can write a story about an animal. And one day I thought, show dogs are the supermodels of the animal world. The way they're treated, the fact that they have to worry all the time about how they look and what they weigh and how they're going to look on camera. And it just struck me, what is it even like to be a show dog? I mean, do they chew on sticks? Have they lost any of their doggishness, or are they actually, once the lights are off, they're back to being a dog? And I was very happy because I proposed it to Tina Brown, and I think she liked stories about what was large in popular culture, but I just turned it a bit. I'm writing about a supermodel. It just happens to be a dog. And she said, yeah, great. I found out from a few dog people who was a contender for Best in Show at Westminster. So in other words, who was like the top show dog in the country. And he was this boxer named Biff, and his handler was hovering. And I finally said, look, can I have a little bit of time alone with him? Which is usually my rule when I do a celebrity profile, is at some point I need time alone. And she looked at me, and I think she was one step ahead of me on this. And she said, well, okay. And Biff worked out on a treadmill every day. So she said, well, he's got to go down on his treadmill now. So if you want time alone with him, that's a perfect time. He'll be on the treadmill. You guys can be alone. And she sent me into the dog gym. Biff got onto his treadmill and started jogging. And I suddenly had this revelation, which was dogs don't talk. And I sat there feeling slightly embarrassed, but also realizing it was really a lot of emotions that hit me about my insistence on having time alone with my subject, failing to sort of acknowledge that this was a dog. But I had stayed true to my principles as a reporter, as I need time alone with my subject. And in fact, sitting there and sort of struggling with this silliness of the situation, which was hilarious and useful in the story. But it was a moment of reflecting on my own choices as a writer. I thought, how many writers in the world, the big blue world, are sitting alone in a gym with a dog on a treadmill and holding their notebook and waiting for quotes? Frankly, and this is why the title, Joyride, is so appropriate, which was the silliness of the moment was overcome by this feeling that I had of pure joy. Mm-hmm. What could be more wonderful, funny, unexpected, full of joy, full of discovery? And the thing that kept coming up to me throughout working on this book was just taking stock of the wonderful experiences I've had, the permission that being a writer gives you to say, can I be alone with this famous show dog? Can I travel with a gospel group? Can I do just about anything?
This book is also about craft, and it's about choosing a creative path in your life. And I learned a lot about craft from reading the book. And one of the things that I never knew about you is that you read all of your stories and your works out loud. before you turn them in. When did you start doing this, and why did you decide that? Because I've actually found this to be a really, I think it's something all writers should do, frankly, and I'm surprised that more don't do it.
I think it's so important. I think I started fairly early in my writing life. I think that I wanted to hear, somehow I trusted my ear to pick up what my eye wasn't picking up. And also, I felt like there was a storytelling quality that I wanted these pieces to have that could only be there if they truly were there in the kind of tone and propulsiveness of a story. And I did a lot of editing based on reading out loud. To me, it's the best, easiest way to edit yourself. Sometimes I'll read things out loud and I'm a little bored with my sentence and I kind of skip over it and I think, well, that's not a good sign. That's a sign that it's a boring sentence. And it's interesting. A lot of times people will say to me that something I wrote seemed short. And I feel like, well, it's not short, but that's a good sign.
Your writing sounds like you. And I have to think that one of the reasons it sounds like you is because you really do refine it so much, and you're so careful in what you put on the page, and also probably in what you leave off. It's really interesting to me because I feel like, each of your paragraphs is a little bit like what Forrest Gump said about the box of chocolates, and there's a surprise in there, paragraph by paragraph. You've always been a pleasure to read, and there's a wryness and a sense of humor to what you write. One of the things I guess I wanted to ask you about, whether you're writing books or magazine articles, where do you look for inspiration?
For story ideas?
Yeah.
That's the great challenge, because I think each time you finish a story, there's a little part of you that feels like that's it, there are no more stories. And of course, that's not true. I've found a number of great stories tucked into the back of a newspaper, little stories that get an inch or two, and you read them and think, this sounds actually very interesting. That's where The Orchid Thief began, an odd headline that triggered me to think I want to know more about this odd circumstance of people stealing orchids. It was like, I had no idea people collected orchids, let alone steal them. So none of the stories I've taken on are naturally easy. And the ones that I think are easy, like the library book, I thought, well, that'll be easy. There's a actual climax of this catastrophic fire that took place, and it gives me a narrative arc. I know what the story is about. Well, of course, writing a simple story about the fire wouldn't have been a very interesting book.
Right. Yeah.
And I got drawn into the question of, why does it feel like it matters so much for a library to burn? Why do we have an emotional, spiritual reaction to the idea of a library burning? And what does that mean to me as a writer, the idea of books not being permanent, when in fact we have this ongoing kind of comfort of feeling like, as hard as it is to write a book, you're creating something that has a permanence that's really unique in the world. It's something that becomes part of the whole culture, and in a sense, forever. So when a library burns, there's so much wrapped up in it.
It worked on the mystery level of a crime that was not solved. It worked on a personal level. The writing about you and your mother was beautiful in that book, and worked on a cultural and intellectual level about the role that libraries play in our lives and our communities. So like all of your work, it had great nuance. I mean, The Orchid Thief, which was a book that was turned in on time, you met that deadline easily. And it's funny because I remember when the movie rights were sold to the Orchid Thief. I was thinking, how is this ever going to be a movie?
You and me both.
And so there's a funny story in Joyride about when you read the script for the Orchid Thief, which became Adaptation, written by Charlie Kaufman. And you read the script about yourself, and why don't you just tell the story?
Well, as you know, we all assumed that they were going to take the story of this crime, which was the theft of these endangered orchids, and somehow make it into a Hollywood movie. And I remember at the time thinking, I do not envy you your job making this into a Hollywood movie, because it's a very interior kind of story and meditative and so forth. And I even remember laughing and saying to my husband, they'll probably put in some Hollywood stuff like car crash, a murder or something. Little did I know how accurate I was. But when they first gave me the script, and they were very careful as they gave it to me and said, you know, there are a lot of people in here who aren't in the book, and it's just, you know, just read it with an open mind. And the first thing that I saw was a scene about me as a child with my parents. And I thought, wait, I didn't expect to be in this movie. And I thought, oh, that's crazy. I don't want my parents in it. I don't want my name in it. The next thing I do is turn further in the script, and there's a scene of Charlie Kaufman watching a porn channel on television, and there I am on the porn channel. And I said, okay, all right, hold on a minute. And as I read further, it showed me having a relationship with John LaRoche. So I called the filmmakers and I said, no. I said, this will ruin my career. I have pretty clear ethical standards about the way I do my work, and I would never get involved with the subject. And here I'm being portrayed not only as being involved with my subject, but later killing a federal officer. And I said, you've got to take my name out. Really. I mean, I can't stop you from making the movie because you bought the option, but no Susan Orlean in the movie. And the producer said to me, well, how are you going to feel if, we're going to have the book and the movie, so it'll be The Orchid Thief by, Jennifer Smith. Mm. And I said, well, wait a minute. No. Okay, let me think this over again, because I thought, well, what's more intense, my vanity or my vanity? Like, it was two choices that felt equally difficult, but in the end, I thought, I can't have someone else's name on my book. I just can't. I can't do it. I really, really resisted, and at the very end, where the window was truly closing, I said, "Oh, just go ahead."
I was so glad you did. I mean, I remember this when it happened, and I just remember thinking, "Oh, just go with it." And then, of course, Meryl Streep wound up playing you, and it was a classic movie, and it all worked out well. And I'm glad that you. It's so interesting because I guess in life we have that choice between a yes or a no, and I thought, oh, the no's not going to get you anything. It would have been a defensive no.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been a no against something happening as opposed to yes, let's see what happens. And I am more of a yes for sure. And I think that is a lot of what I wrote about in the book, that saying yes, taking the chance, even if it's a little risky, always has felt to me like the right answer. That you're never going to know if you don't try. And things obviously don't always work out, but there was really no instance that I wrote about in the book where I said no.
And that was something that you also didn't say no to until you got to the ultimate no. with your divorce. And I don't think we want to go into it too much here because I think it's actually better to read about in the book. But I was interested in your decision to write about your first marriage because, again, I was just on the other side of this as an editor, and I had no idea of the hardship that you went through in your marriage. And writing about it must not have been an easy decision. And I was just wondering how you came to that decision to write about it.
It was definitely not an easy decision. And obviously, it's not an easy subject. It was very, it stirred up a lot of painful memories and emotions that I had put to rest, more or less. I feel like I've always been present in what I've written without really revealing a lot about myself. And I feel like this was the moment where I was going to say, let me, in keeping with my philosophy about pulling the camera back a little further and a little further, this was the ultimate where I was saying, I'm going to really pull the camera back and tell you what was going on in my life, in my mind, my personal experience, losing my parents. And certainly my first marriage was very connected to a lot of the way I went about my career, for better or worse. And it was especially connected to the writing of The Orchid Thief in many ways. And when Adaptation first came out, and in it, Meryl Streep, who's playing me, is obviously suffering through a marriage that isn't working, it was really shocking because I thought, well, I didn't think I had ever made that very plain to readers. I was very private about it. And yet, looking back in the book and detecting this yearning for passion and yearning for love, for lack of a better word, I think Charlie saw through to this unspoken fact that it was a very difficult time for me, and that it did affect the writing of the book. I mean, writing is so close to being. It's really just a different level of how you are in the world. It's just putting down on paper who and what you are in the world. And this was a chance to finally say to the reader, look, you've come on all of these journeys with me. Let me share a little more. And
that was exactly how I felt as the reader. I felt like from when I read Joyride, I felt like I got the full Susan Orlean, and in a way that I never had before. And it was immensely satisfying. I have one final question that I need to ask you that I've wanted to ask you the whole time we've worked together. I never have. And I'm just wondering whether you think being a redhead has in any way affected the way you write or report.
100%. I do. I think being a redhead means from the time you're born, you are different. You're different. And people notice you. You're always not the main part of the Venn diagram. I think as a result, I've felt both separate and special. And separate, which can be painful. Like you have this desire. I mean, I used to dream of having brown hair and brown eyes. But you also feel special in the sense that you're a minority, you're distinct, you're noticeable, you're people remember you quite easily, actually. And I think a lot of my curiosity about these subsets of culture that people belong to so intensely, I have a feeling some of that curiosity comes from that feeling a little like an outsider always. not always in an uncomfortable way, but definitely as a distinct sense of who I am. I'm not like everybody else. So I'm also very comfortable in that position.
Well, you are my favorite redheaded literary journalist. And I want to just ask you also, you write in the book about all the different editors you've had. I was only briefly your editor, although I loved being your editor. You've had a very long and satisfying relationship with Jofi Ferrari Adler and Avid Reader Press. And I'm just wondering if you could say anything about the dynamic of working with Jofi and on these most recent books.
Oh, it's been amazing. It really has. I think an editor has this tricky balancing act between getting out of your way, but providing you with the sense that there's someone there kind of keeping their hand on your back. You're steady, you're okay. And that's not easy. I think you have editors who are too much in your face, and then you have editors who simply aren't present at all. Jofi has that really, really wonderful balance. I feel like he is always on my side. He's always there if I think, look, I can't figure this out. What's the right way to do this? He's absolutely there, and I never feel like I would be embarrassed to present him with a question. I've got a lot of pride in not wanting my editor to ever think that I'm not 100% sure of myself. But I feel with him a freedom to say, I can't figure out if this is working. And at the same time, I feel like he really trusts me, and that's so important. And it's in correct proportion to how much I feel I want to be trusted, if that makes sense. I feel like he really understands how I work and how to be there when I'm unsure. It's just been great. It's just been such a wonderful, rewarding relationship, and I trust his honesty.
Well, there was a gleam in his eye when he told me that Joyride had come in, and I know that he revered it the minute, and he reveres you. He loved it. I love it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
On The Right Reasons, Susan Orlean, the author of Joyride, coming out this October 2025.